typically when we take on some objective or are pursuing some goal, that very often we sort of put together a plan, we try and stick to the plan, and maybe we modify the plan, and slowly, bit by bit, we make our way towards whatever that objective is. And I sort of thought, well, what happens when the plan doesn't work? Or maybe the plan wasn't there in the first place, or it just falls apart and you don't make it towards your objective. Which brings me on to my summer holidays, because I got involved in this sport by a friend of mine, a guy called Oisin Cray, and he introduced me to this sport of paramotoring. And what it involves is you have this engine and you put it on your back, it has a propeller on it, and you have a wing, and it allows you to run forward and step up into the sky with the wing holding everything together. And you can see me looking somewhat perplexed there, because again, you're reliant on about 50 or 60 of those strings to sort of create the shape in the wing, but also allow you to remain connected to it and not just plummet down to the ground. And it's a brilliant sport because I can go up for about 3 or 4 hours, I can travel at about 50 kilometers an hour, and I can go about 10,000 feet off the ground. But as I say, it's a bit concerning, and it actually feels more like this. You're sort of sitting there with your legs dangling out over the sky. And indeed, I'll let you in on a secret. Sometimes during the day, as the warm air builds up, you get buffeted around quite a lot. And to calm my nerves, I've discovered that Phil Collins, at volume 10, Phil Collins' Greatest Hits, takes the edge off. You can try that yourself at some stage. And in my wisdom, I decided, okay, the best way to get into this sport and really get a sense of it would be to use it as a mode of transport. And so a couple of months after getting into it, I found myself out on the western edge of Mongolia, the 8th largest country in the world, and more or less deserted. There's only about 5 million people live there. And I had this great plan. I was going to travel from the western border for 1,600 kilometers out to the eastern border. And what I would do is I would get up early in the morning, put on the machine, step up into the sky, and just keep going until I got too nervous or ran out of fuel. And as a plan, it was actually quite interesting, because it was a great way of simply dropping into communities. And you have to look at it from their perspective. They'd be going about their daily work, and suddenly this guy hanging from a bunch of strings drops down into the middle of them. And more often than not, I would sort of collapse in a heap with the wing dropping in on top of me. But you get to connect with the community very quickly. You're immediately part of their environment. And very often when I'm flying, I can't take any weight with me. So I'd arrive down with no food, with no water. I wouldn't have a tent, a sleeping bag. I wouldn't even have a mat to lie on. And I then have to find those resources locally. And it could take a day, 2 days, or even 3 days, depending on how remote the location was. And then at night time, I'd kick a little recess in the ground for my shoulder, another one for my hip. I'd lay my head down on the seat of the paramotor, pull the wing over me and fall asleep, get up the next morning, put the gear back on and step back up into the sky and travel on the journey. And it was a slightly difficult process, but a very revealing one. When you're up in the air, you get this tremendous perspective of where you are that you never get when you're down on the ground. And they also have this great agency, this freedom, that if there's somewhere that is of interest to you, you can just simply fly towards it. And there's been a few times where I simply cruised along riverbeds, or indeed traveled along the edges of mountains. And in fact, I ended up landing on one of those hills and simply cruised in onto the top, went to sleep, and then literally stepped off the mountain the next day and carried on with the journey. Now, I'd like to make out that these are all sort of a series of successes. But in reality, I have a 100% failure record on every single trip that I've done. I've never once made it to point B. In the case of Mongolia, I traveled for about 4 weeks. I got about 1,300 kilometers. And the sheer stress of the days that I was encountering meant that I had to give up. And what I mean by that is that when I'd land in these communities or these isolated places, there'll be all kinds of crazy things would happen. I've been beaten up, I've been arrested on numerous occasions, deported. I even survived an attempted kidnapping. I've gotten lost, I've had equipment failure, bad crash landings. And so every day, not only do I fail to actually reach that final objective, but on a daily basis, I would fail to even cover the distance that I'd set out for myself. All kinds of, as I say, problems and issues would pop up. And so physically and psychologically stressed, tail between my legs, I headed back to Ireland. And I remember saying to my wife, Suzanne, that, if you ever hear me talking about doing something like this again, stop me. she let me down badly, because the following year I then found myself in Uzbekistan. And again, that went disastrously wrong as well. And I couldn't quite work it out, because I'm a sort of a linear kind of a person, that typically I try to get, I have some objective, I try to make my way towards it. But in this case, I was failing consistently, and yet I kept coming back to it. And it wasn't until the third trip. This time I was back in Mongolia, and I was heading from the Siberian border down to China, and I was going to try and then finish with a great flourish by flying along the Great Wall of China. And I was about 3 weeks into it, out over the middle of the Gobi Desert, and I had problems with my engine, so I came down and landed. And then these two characters appeared on a motorbike out of nowhere, and two local Mongolians, nice guys. And they were chatting and sort of just generally inquisitive about what I was doing, but after about 10 minutes, they just disappeared. Now, another thing about Mongolians is that they tend to be the last people to leave the party. And so for them to just suddenly step up and to leave meant most likely that I'd just been robbed. And I looked, and sure enough, I was missing my MP3 player. So I put together my machine again, got back up into the sky, and I was really furious with these two guys. And like James Bond, I just tore back across the desert, chasing after the lads. And after about 20 minutes, I could spot the motorcycle outside this yurt. So I dropped down, took off the equipment, went up to the two guys, and had this blazing row with the fellas, looking to get the MP3 back. Now, fortunately for me, after a while, they backed down and they handed it back to me. So I kind of turned victoriously and strode back towards my paramotor. One of the things about a paramotor is the fuel tank at the back is translucent, so you can tell how much fuel you've got left. As I walked back towards the paramotor, I could see that I was completely out of fuel. And here I was in the middle of the Gobi Desert. I had no water, I had no food, I had no fuel. It was about to get very hot. And the only two people in about a 50-kilometer radius that could be of any use to me were the guys I just had a fight with. So two things happened. One, I turned on my heel, went back up to the two lads with a big smile on my face. Sure, we're only having a bit of fun. Any chance of a couple of litres of petrol? Now, they took good advantage of the situation. They leveraged their position well, because the petrol turned out to be quite expensive. Anyway, got fueled up and then carried on my journey. And if you've been paying attention, you've probably worked out that I still actually haven't seen the Great Wall of China. I said two things happened. The second thing was, when I thought about that moment, I realized that it was very different what I did. Normally, if somebody steals from me, if I have an argument with somebody, I'm not sort of going to be very friendly to them. I'll bear a grudge. They're off the Christmas card list. And yet at that time, I found it very easy to switch from being very angry to being friendly. And that was very untypical of me. And that's where I had the revelation. That's where I realized that these trips, that it wasn't so much about getting from point A to point B. That actually wasn't the point. That was actually a bit of a conceit. That the real value of what I was doing was actually the problems that I was encountering every time I landed. It was the challenges. It was having to be dynamic and be creative and come up with solutions to problems that I had never envisaged happening. And I realized that instead of actually being on this tourist journey, what I actually set up was this sort of boot camp of resilience. I was having, every time I landed, to fix solutions, to find myself in these sort of adverse conditions and come up with a solution and adapt to it. As a result of that, I'd kind of increased my capacity. I'd become more adept cognitively at working out what the problem was and what a solution might be. I'd gotten better sort of behaviorally at working with people and coming up or arriving at that solution. And also my sort of emotional intelligence had improved. I couldn't simply have the emotions that I wanted to have at any moment. I had to be the person that was able to solve that problem or that situation that I found myself in. More than that, I also realized that I gained insight to myself. We all have these stories that we sort of tell ourselves about ourselves. And they allow us, I suppose, to navigate our space in the world and so on. And I'd realized that some of those stories, some of those myths about myself and about the world simply didn't stand up under pressure. So I had to reconfigure, to rethink what I was doing and how I was doing it. And I thought about that, and I also realized that I'd read a book previously by Rebecca Solnit. It's a lovely book called The Field Guide to Getting Lost. And what Rebecca talks about is that at a literal level, if you're standing somewhere and there's a mountain in the distance, that there's a kind of a blue haze between you and that mountain. And she calls that the blue of distance. as a sort of a metaphor level, whether it's an objective that we have in education, business, relationships, or whatever, that distance, that gap between where we are and where we're trying to get, that's the blue of distance. It's kind of that tension, that space between. And we tend to think of that as being something that we have to get over, something we just have to suffer through. But Rebecca says, no, you should look at that in a different way. You should look at the opportunity that exists within that space. And she goes a step further, because she says every now and then you should step into a blue of distance that you're going to get lost in. You should take on a challenge that's so complicated, brings you up to the edge of chaos, and indeed brings you into failure, because it's in there that the real value can be. Because experience of just success convinces you that the way you've behaved in the past is going to be successful or effective in the future. But experience of failure prepares you for the unintended, the unpredictable. And I had a look around as well, because I realized I wasn't the only idiot doing this kind of stuff. These guys are taking part in what's called the Mongol Car Rally. And it's this ridiculous journey. You start off south of London and you head 10,000 miles due east, across to the capital, Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. There's 3 rules. 1, your vehicle can't be worth more than £2,000. It can't have an engine bigger than 1200 cc, so it's a very small vehicle. And third of all, you can't modify the car to make it more suitable for the journey. In other words, you have to buy this 10-year-old banger and try and get this sort of entirely unsuitable vehicle across on this very improbable journey. What's interesting about this is that it fills up every year. Actually, 2024 is booked up, but 25 has some vacancies in it. But what happens is that the people who go on this rally, they actually make it more difficult for themselves. This rally, in a way, is again, going back to Rebecca, it's their blue of distance. And what people do is that sometimes they, instead of going due east to Mongolia, they head up north. They go as far north as they can into Norway, and then maybe go all the way down into southern Spain before finally heading east. More than that, in case you sort of think I'm pushing the point, these 2 guys here, the guy on the left is 6'3". The vehicle they chose for the journey was a 40-year-old Mini Minor. Probably the most unsuitable vehicle they could have brought. But not only do they not modify it to make it more suitable for the journey, now you can see that, aerodynamically, this is not wise. And yes, it's part of it is to have good photographs and good stories. But there's easier ways to get likes on social media. And what they're discovering is the same sort of realization that I had, and indeed that Rebecca talks about in terms of that blue of distance. That in this event, it's actually not the person who arrives first at the finish line that's considered to be successful. It's the people that arrive last, or indeed don't even arrive at the finish line. It's the people that have to push their car the final few meters. It's battered. Their relationships are strained. There's a lovely excerpt in this video, or in this the website. It's The Adventures is the name of the organization that hosts this, and they've got all kinds of races and competitions around the world. But on their website they say, should you phone us because you've gotten badly lost in some remote country, you've been arrested, the engine's falling out of your car, you'll hear a chuckle on the end of the line and the soft click of the receiver, because you're on your own. And that's the point. Again, like Rebecca, that these individuals, what they're doing is they're finding this blue of distance. They're finding something that's totally improbable. And they're not just stepping into it in order to have a plan, follow the plan, and reach the objective. They're stepping into it in order to fail. Because they know that they'll have experiences in that failure, in that chaotic world that they're in, that they'll never have in a well-planned, realistic project. When I looked around as well, I realized that increasingly more and more people are engaging in these kind of blue of distance agendas. And I think millennials and Generation Z, I think they get it to a greater extent. There's more and more people doing things like mud runs, where you step into an environment that's inherently you're out of your depth, that you've never experienced before. That's going to be challenging and difficult. And to me, that's one example, again, of people pursuing this blue of distance, of deliberately entering into a process that's going to be uncomfortable, that's going to bring you to the edge of what you're capable of doing, and indeed where there's a very high likelihood of failure. I could probably have saved us all a bit of time if I've simply showed this at the very start, because the late, great Leonard Cohen gets it. Leonard makes 2 points. One, that there isn't a perfect route. There is no perfect way to do anything. There's no plan that will always work out and so on. But more than that, by stepping into failure, by stepping to the edge of what's possible and going beyond that, it's by having those cracks, those limitations, experience the limitations of what you can do. That's where the light comes in. And so far as my epiphany goes, what I've realized is that experience, that crazy journeys across these different countries that on the surface end in failures, that what they've actually given me is increased bandwidth. When I come back to the everyday world, I find that I'm better able to take on projects and consider projects that previously would have been at the edge or would have been uncomfortable doing. More than that, I find I have more bandwidth as well when it comes to simply dealing with the problems that pop up on a day-by-day basis. Because the truth is, and it hurts me to say this, there are times in the everyday when Phil Collins' greatest hits, it's not enough. Thank you very much for your time, folks.